So do as you would have them do to you. It's obviously at the heart of today's gospel lesson. And I think that because it's been a part, great teaching for now millennia of Christianity, and also because it's shared in some form, that same command, by a range of other traditions, we're tempted, I think, to see it as something that's aesthetically beautiful and not get beyond that. Not get to the fact that to do that requires us to draw on the best of who we are, the depth of who we are as human beings. The depth, the most profound of who we are. And that is not an easy thing to pull off. And yet it's the regular command we're supposed to do. It's something that has to do with mastering the art, I would say, of being relentlessly loving people. So I want to try to get at that today, to be able to think about what it means for us to tailor to ourselves, our specific personalities, because each of us has things that trip us up in terms of our ability to respond this way. Let's dive in and see what first the Scripture might say about this and how that might play out in our lives. In Luke, I think that we are called to do this great work of transformation repeatedly. What I was trying to get at with the young people. That not only are we supposed to make this general commitment not to be overwhelmed by what the culture says to us, but rather in loving our enemies, because that's a really general command. And quite honestly, enemies tend to be defined by people and institutional rules. That's repeatedly the case. What does it mean for us to really step back from having that type of sort of institutionalized, identity-defining relationship to people that is fundamentally negative? What does it mean for something that I've started saying more recently to really exclude the word enemy from our vocabulary? And how do we do that? By agape love. It seems to me that we are called by Jesus to embrace agape love as foundational in all of our behaviors towards people. Bonhoeffer used to say we're supposed to see Jesus really through the lens of Christ. That each one of our relationships is mediated by Christ. And I would say by the love of Christ, that manifestation of it. And what's interesting is that when we do that, the joy, that is the blessedness, that's the thing that really crowns all of this. This is what you probably heard Chris talk about last week, those of you here. This is Luke's version of the Beatitudes. The joy or the blessedness of it is that it connects us directly to God, the essence of God. Remember what 1 John tells us, that God is love. That when we love, we are in fact nudging against the very essence of God. And what's interesting too is that it turns the values all upside down. If you look at either Matthew's version of the Beatitudes or Luke's, it says all this stuff that we feel uncomfortable about. We don't want to be weak people. We don't want to be meek people. And Jesus is trying to get us to rethink some of those things. He's trying to get us to think about how empty, superficial outward strength can be, and how profoundly important inner strength can be. And he's calling us to this, lifelong discipline, lifelong sort of strategy built on self-knowledge, once again, of transforming all of our relationships and our ways of dealing with people. To face hatred with actions that benefit the person that is hating you. To face exclusion with efforts to be in community with the people that are pushing you away. And fighting them repeatedly in the community. You can't will that to happen, but constantly being open to trying to have community. To face cursing and defamation with kind words that build up a person. That word edify literally means to build up that person. To make a decision to face abusiveness, terrible stuff that can be, with prayer that liberates both you but also the person ultimately when they seem trapped in the determination to harm. And then in all other things, quite honestly, in the deepest understanding, to improvise. That is, to pursue the most loving outcome possible, no matter what comes up. Because it's going to be unexpected, and improvisation has to do with the unforeseen. So what it means for us to respond when stuff surprises us. It does it all the time. And what does it mean for us to work to be prepared? So let's think about how that might manifest itself in life. It's an improvisation that I would suggest to you that a woman by the name of Kika Randall really had to deal with. I don't know if you know that name. Kika Randall was one of the two-person team that won the first cross-country gold medal, first cross-country medal of any kind, quite honestly, in 42 years for the U.S. team in 2018, and the first gold medal for the United States. And she did that on February 21st with her teammate, Jess Higgins, I believe is her last name. And
Diggins.
What's that?
Jesse Diggins.
Diggins is the last name. Thanks so much. She won that together with her on February 21st, 2018. And in May, on Mother's Day, found out that she had cancer. And so what was amazing, after she went through all the stuff that we have observed people we love go through, of asking the questions of why, and thinking about the unfair quality of that, man, did she face that head on. She sought the treatment. She went to her hometown. She and her husband had just settled in a small town in British Columbia. She went to her hometown of Anchorage because she wasn't in Canada long enough to get health care. She goes to Anchorage, gets her care going there, undergoes 33 treatments of radiation, I believe it was. Goes through chemotherapy. And man, just about as soon as she could, she was back in her workout room, getting herself strengthened up. She was riding her bike to get her radiation therapy to and from that. In September, she won a 10-kilometer run in the town that they lived in Canada. Last month, while still finishing the radiation treatment, she won the women's event and a dual-a-thon ski event in Anchorage. You might know that she was the honorary starter of the Birkebeiner this year. That race finished 12th a month after she had finished radiation treatment. She was here in town early to talk about skiing and to cheer it on and to talk to youth in our community about it and about her life. During a recent trip to the cross-country trails near her home, her husband commented, after everything, it's great to see her out there on skis. It's her happy place. You see, this destructive force had come into her body. And even in those antagonisms that ourselves do towards us, we're called somehow to hold on to passion, to fight them back, to struggle within our very bodies. And that struggle can take on other forms as well. It can be with nature, with animals we might fear. I think, for example, of a little girl by the name of Gabby. Gabby Mann lives in the city of Seattle. And in 2011, crows began to follow her. She was 4 years old. They followed her because they noticed over time, crows being the intelligent creatures they are, that she dropped a lot of food. And so there you would see this little girl walking in her backyard and these crows, a handful of them following her. She began leaving food for the neighborhood crows in her garden. And when she started going to school, crows would follow her to the bus stop, and her parents had enough insight to pack a couple of lunches because she'd give one of them to the crows. They'd wait for her as she came home. She would go out into the backyard eventually, and there would be on either the clotheslines or the electric lines, perhaps a dozen or 2 dozen crows waiting for her. And what was amazing is that, quote, the crows began leaving her gifts. She has this collection of 70 beads, buttons, pieces of metal. Sometimes it's really gross animal part. But it's as if they are responding to her action with their own actions. They even left her part of a bracelet, a friend bracelet, that simply said, best. Her mother tells the most interesting story, though, and that is that they tend to keep an eye on them. She and the mom was outside taking some photographs. I'm not sure if it was a sunset or what it was. Actually, it was of an eagle near their house. birds are drawn to themselves, interestingly. Taking a photograph, and evidently she dropped her camera cap, the lens cap, on the ground in the alley behind her home. And that lens cap showed up at the bird bath, and she actually watched as the crow washed it out and then laid it on the edge. You see, it's an amazing thing how it's built into nature, too, for there to be some sort of interaction that we sometimes get right, and sometimes it's quite mysterious. Sometimes we're ignorant about. But somehow within not only our bodies, but between our species and other species, there's this innate invitation to have a transformative relationship with that is. And our day in which human beings are impinging on nature in a terrible way, it's really important for us to see that. There's, of course, then the more difficult relationship, the most difficult relationship of all, of course, and that is with human beings. And I just remembered hearing recently the story of this former member of the parliament of Denmark. Her name is Aslan Seke. She was born in Turkey, and her family moved when she was a young girl to Denmark. And she decided to run as one of the first person of ethnic minorities in Denmark to run for the House of Parliament in 2007. And it wasn't long after she began serving that she started receiving hate mail, and specifically hate messages. All of them beginning with a derogatory response about her ethnicity or her gender. She said she never really answered them. She deleted them until one of her fellow members of the House told her she had to at least keep them in case she needed evidence for there to be a follow-up on a crime should it take place. She actually started doing so, but she said when she became more and more involved in the debates of the House, more and more hate messages would come in. And she said it was really interesting. The one time she was at the zoo with her family, and she's receiving phone calls from this neo-Nazi who would just not let up. And she was afraid that was actually stalking her family. When they got back home, her son said, "Mom, why does he hate you so much? When he doesn't even know you." Several weeks later, she was with a friend at a friend's house, and the friend said to her, "You got to meet with these people." She said, "What?" She said, "They'll kill me." She said, and that friend said, "No, the member of the Denmark Parliament's not going to be killed by somebody like that." And so she took a chance, and the first person she contacted was a guy by the name of Ingolf. And what was interesting is that after that meeting, and with that meeting and going on to the dozens of people she's met over 8 years, she discovered that she came to realize that she has been just as judgmental of them as they had been of her. That a lot of people tend to want to blame the other for the problems that go on in a society, rather than taking the time to connect with one another, to solve those problems with society. She said something like this: "My friendship with Turks, with Danes, with Jews, and with racists has vaccinated me against my own prejudices." And so she started this, what she called #dialogue coffee meetings for that purpose. A friend of hers, a Jewish man, whose son had been killed in a bombing of a synagogue in Copenhagen in 2015, rejected fully the idea of revenge, and he said, "Evil can only be defeated by kindness between people. Kindness demands courage." And so her challenge is to everyone who she meets is have the courage. Find your Ingolfs. Tenaciously go for the conversations. Don't expect them to say yes first. Maybe over time it'll happen. Don't give up. We have a responsibility decision. And I think that that's a key part of what we're hearing in the message of Jesus, that we have decisions to make, that faithfulness is strategic, oftentimes, because we are complicated people and will give in to instinct rather than decisiveness. And so make the decision. But the second thing really comes from the Joseph passage, and I think it's the overwhelming nature of this thing. The overwhelming, personally, I have to say, overwhelming difficulty it can sometimes be to put the brake on and not give in to the instinctive response. But then, when you give in, when you give in to facing the difficulty, and when you experience the liberating power of it, of making that transformation. It's an amazing thing. That's the reason the emotion of Joseph is key to that passage. It's key. His brothers, think about the story. The meandering path that Joseph experienced to get to Egypt. Think of the danger he went through. That his brothers wanted to murder him. I mean, his father Jacob was a great guy, but he was a preferential father. He just set things up for Joseph to be under attack by his children, by his brothers. And so most of them wanted to kill him. Thankfully, Reuben said no. But he's sold into slavery still. And he goes through this path, he lands in jail, falsely accused of action against the wife of the person who held him, and all of this. And finally, his gift of dreams gets him into the house of interpreting dreams, gets him into the house of Pharaoh. And there he can make a difference. And when he finally sees his brothers whose malice led them to get him in Egypt, he was able to do the transformation. He was able not to judge them and to put them in a position of facing terrible consequences for their terrible behavior. It's one of those things in which an overwhelming sense of grace takes him in the direction he needed to go. Emotions we don't trust. We ought to stop that nonsense and interpret them. We ought to think about Hagar's fear when she's thrown out of the house of Abraham, but taken care of by God along with little Ishmael. We ought to think of God being moved to act in the Exodus. We ought to think about God being overwhelmed with grace and a loving Father who welcomes back his prodigal son. How dare we forget the emotion that has to be packed in that? And so to me it's interesting then to think of a few people who are overwhelmed somehow in such a way that they get it. And what a better starting place to talk about what it means to be overwhelmed by grace, to talk briefly about a woman by the name of Grace. Grace Bignotto. A woman who was a part of a very strange contest in Toronto, Canada in the late 1920s. It was a contest that a wealthy man died and left as a condition for getting part of his will. He basically challenged the women of Canada to have as many children as they could in 10 years. Yeah, a little disturbing, right? To have as many children as possible. And Bignotto and some other women were unfairly treated as they participated in this contest. And ultimately, they were cheated out of their chance to compete. Nonetheless, Grace became this legendary figure in her family that gathers even to this day annually in her honor. And to give you a sense of the spirit of her, there was an interview with one of the people that was at the latest event. And they asked, was Grace sort of angry she didn't get any money out of that competition? And the woman responded, well, of course not. She said she was a remarkable woman. She said, let me tell you a story that her daughter told me once. She said her mother had made a huge pot of sauce on the stove for Sunday dinner. She was a fabulous cook, Grace was. And she asked Mildred, her daughter, and one of the boys to put it back on the back stoop, the back porch, in order to allow it to cool. Well, they did so, and they went back. The mother, Grace, told them to get it, and found no sauce. It had been taken. And Mildred, her daughter, was so angry, she went back to her mother, reported, and she said, her mother Grace said, calm down. Mildred, just think. Someone's having such a wonderful meal tonight. That was her response. Wasn't that an amazing thing? I don't know much more about her story than that, but some convergence of factors in her life made her someone who could appreciate the power of someone responding to creativity, even in a meandering way that didn't seem quite so right. Grace, who understood grace. So hostility and responding to it in a way that's transformative. I think of another story. There's a woman who's going to be retiring soon. She's the coach of the UCLA gymnastics team. You've not heard some of the stories about gymnastics in the United States, and there's some that are just not pretty. But UCLA, evidently, because of the work of Valerie Kondo's field, has become this oasis. When they interview students, college students, prospective members of the team, they don't ask them any questions about why they weren't in the Olympics or what are their plans for getting into the Olympics. They don't even ask those sort of things. They want to know what's going to happen after gymnastics. What are your plans? They want to know, and she's wanted to know always, what it is that makes those young women tick. She wants them to be young women who have a sense of who their voices are. So it wasn't surprising at all that one of her sportspersons, in the midst of her team members, I should say, in the midst of her routine at one of the recent competitions, used one of the Michael Jackson moonwalking routines as part of her routine because of self-expression, and that was permitted. And this was someone who had been really on the brink of being an Olympic athlete. She had to go to UCLA to regain her love of gymnastics again. She had a challenge health-wise in 2014, and she invited her team members in to understand what it means to face that challenge. She's someone who was a big fan of the great John Wooden. And up on her wall of her office is one of his sayings, "Success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you did your best to become the best you are capable of becoming." It's that kind of depth that informs her. Grace that respects each person's, each neighbor's identity. The deal is this: in an institution that is sometimes hard to find, institutions can stand against that and be pools of hostility, not on the UCLA gymnastics team. And I think finally about this story of a little girl by the name of Sam. Because there is the power for us to transform our neighborhoods too. Little Sam lives in Newton, Massachusetts, little neighborhood. At the age of 2, she was someone who was dealing with the fact that she was born deaf, incapable of hearing, but very fluent in signing already. She said her parents said that her own personality changes when someone is willing to communicate with her. On the other hand, if someone can't, it makes her sad. She tries to be neighborhoodly, but the person can't sign, so they can't engage at that level. So what happens? On their own, the neighbors in that neighborhood hired an instructor to learn how to sign, fully immerse themselves in American Sign Language. The teacher said it's amazing because there are plenty of parents of deaf children that never learn how to sign, but this neighborhood chose to do so. He said it would almost absolutely guarantee her being a happier, more well-adjusted young little girl. And one of the neighbors said, "You should see her when she comes in at the end of class. The first thing she says to us is, 'Friend.' She said, 'I think your heart would melt just as mine did.'" What does it mean? What does it mean, friends, for us not to tolerate our worst impulses, but for us to work, to cultivate, to have classes perhaps, to work on transforming that instinctive response that we have to hatred as it hits us and refuse to give in to it. You see, from the time of ancient mythology to the present, there were things called shapeshifters. In our time are superheroes of action movies. They could transform in a turn of the dime to whatever is necessary to meet the moment. And for Christ's followers, for us who seek to follow Christ, it has to be the way we embrace others we have difficulty with. It has to be the way that we try to take to transform hatred into love. When we do that, I would suggest that the outcomes are relentlessly cumulative, one thought building on another, one action leading to the next. And our lives and those around us are incrementally changed. And salvation, which is fundamentally healing, makes its way through us for the world, changing the world, even saving the world. Let's pray. This day, O Lord, we are so appreciative of your continuous tenacity. We keep the joy, emotion-filled joy of Joseph before us. We think of the prodigal father, the father of the prodigal son, the loving father, repeatedly looking to see when his son would return, and knowing that you look for us as well in our worst moments and inviting us back in the community. This day, transform our hearts, make us be transforming people, transformed by love, ready to offer it to others. We ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. Would you join me now in our hymn?